Welcome to the West End Video Newsletter. My name is Joe LaPiccolo, your host for this week's newsletter. Geez, we have a real great show coming up. We're honored to have Professor Marc Fried, professor from Boston College, who's a professor of psychology and human sciences. And you're retired right now, Mr. Fried.
Well, if you want to call it that.
But you're still very active.
Yeah.
And you also wrote a book called The World of the Urban Working Class. And can you get a shot of this book here? And it's noted and well read, and it's in all the libraries throughout the world and the city of Boston. And it's a history of what went on in the West End. Can you tell us how you first got involved in the study of the West End?
Yeah, I had decided that I wanted to do some research in the Boston area. I had graduated from with my PhD a few years before, and I had been working at the Mass Mental Health Center doing clinical work. And then I decided that I didn't really want to do clinical work anymore. I wanted to do research. So I came over to the Mass General, and Eric Lindemann at the time was interested in the possibility. He knew that there was an urban renewal program slated.
And who was, can you explain to us who Eric Lindemann is? Or was?
Yeah. Eric Lindemann at the time was chief of psychiatry at the Mass General Hospital. He was a rather prominent man in the field. Subsequently, he went out to Stanford, even while we were still working on the study in Boston. And he had a lot of contacts in Washington, and one of the people in particular that he had been working with, a man by the name of Dr. Leonard Dual, had indicated that he would be very much interested if Dr. Lindemann could mount a study to look at what happened to people when they were displaced from an area where they had so many involvements. And so just around this time, almost by chance...
What year would that be?
That was 1957, the early part of 1957.
That's when the talk of taking the West End was just...
Well, then it was imminent.
Starting.
Yeah, right. Because the talk about taking the West End really started around 1953.
That's right. Yeah, right.
And then it continued throughout that period. And he had been doing some studies of crises in people's lives, and so this looked like a population crisis that might be very important. Yes, it certainly was. And so Leonard Dual and he became interested in that, and just around that time I decided that I wanted to start looking for a job doing research. And so I met Dual and I met Lindemann, and I eventually became director of the study, which became a very, very large-scale study, I have to say, a huge study with, there must have been at least 20 to 30 people working on it at any one time. And Herb Gans was also on this study, but he was separate from the study.
Okay. Herb Gans was professor...
He was professor of sociology at Columbia University.
Okay.
And he spent approximately a year and a half, I believe, in the West End, and a very different kind of study. It wasn't a very large-scale systematic study, but it was more an observational study in which he was talking to people, meeting with people, and so forth. And he put that together in a book called The Urban Villagers. And simultaneously, we were beginning to work on this and with a very large staff. And we did a whole series of interviews, and what was especially interesting and very rare is that we were able to interview people before they moved and then 2 years later after they moved. And that was a very unusual experience.
Approximately how many people did you interview?
Of course, there are different numbers of men and women and different numbers before and after, but on average, we could say that we interviewed about 500 families.
Boy, that's quite a study.
Yeah, it's a huge, huge study. Anywhere, people from 20 years old up. We didn't interview the teenagers.
Right.
Although Herb Gans had actually observed quite a few of the teenage relationships, but we didn't work with the teenagers.
And Herb Gans also took a lot of photos of the teenagers, and in the residence and buildings and so forth.
I believe so.
He took around 70 photos. That, yeah.
Well, there were a number of people taking some very interesting photos. It would be nice to put them all together at this
We'd love to do that.
But I've seen some of them. I think I mentioned to you some marvelous photos that this rather well-known photographer by the name of Caponegro took. And he and I have been talking about doing something with this. In any case, at that point, I took over, and we had offices in various places near the West End and near the Mass General. My first experience in the West End when we were walking around, but I think people probably thought we were part of the redevelopment authority.
Yeah, people were skeptical of strangers. If you study the West End, you know, I grew up in the West End, that if you weren't part of the West End or didn't live there, people were skeptical. They knew you didn't live there.
That's right.
So you had to really convince them that you were legitimate to get by.
That's right. My first experience was to have a bag of garbage from the 5th floor dropped right next to me.
Okay, I could see that.
And I figured that they must think that I'm part of the redevelopment authority rather than researchers really looking out for their interest as much as anything. And so, in any case, we then got started and began to do studies of mostly how people lived and how they felt about all of this. And that's really what the book is about, trying to show what life was like in the West End, because in many respects it was I won't say unusual. Today it seems unusual. In fact, the reason I called it the world of the urban working class is one of the things I tried to show was that there are places all over the world where working class populations, poorer people, people who sort of work day to day for a living, lived in this kind of almost communal type of arrangement in which their neighbors were terribly important to them, in which the community was terribly important to them, in which they met one another at the same church, at the same clubs, at the same settlement houses, at the same stores, and that after a while they really felt like a part of one another.
Professor, tell me something. Do you think what was different about the West End in these other areas that you have looked at and studied, where the West End was noted for a population of all different types of immigrants from all different types of countries living together under one roof? And was that so? I know in other areas that I've looked at, there's mainly Italian or Jewish or black, segregated in each different part. But this was a neighborhood. That's why Gans call it the urban village.
Right.
Because of that type of population.
Well, it's a little different, but not all that different.
Okay.
There were areas that had very mixed populations going back to the beginning of the century. It's a result of who moved in when and how long they had a chance to settle down and become close to one another. What was different, however, was the fact that, of course you know the history, I'm sure, that Martin Lamazny had been the political big shot.
He was the boss.
He was the political boss.
Ward boss.
And he had very, very strong feelings about mixed ethnic groups. And I still remember very, very distinctly one of the old social workers, I believe she's dead now, probably Frida.
Oh, sure. Frida was at the Elizabeth Peabody House for years.
I remember her telling me that when they first moved in, shortly after the turn of the century, they first moved into the West End, and they were visited by 3 of Martin Lamazny's men. One was Jewish, one was Italian, one was Irish. And the 3 of them talked to them and said, "You're very welcome here. We'd like you to be here. If you ever have any trouble at all, just let us know. If anybody ever calls you a dirty Jew or anything of that sort, just let us know." And I think that his influence really brought about this League of Nations quality that everybody talked about.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the first things people would say when we asked them about it was, "This is a League of Nations."
It is. It was.
And
the smells of the different foods and ethnic, it was in each building you'd have a different nationality, and you know each family was invited into each other's homes. Everybody lived as one, which you don't find today. That's missing in today's world.
It's very rare, and that was a little bit unique. Although, as I say, You find it to some degree in other places, but not as strongly. When you look at, like we were able to look at who was friends with whom, it's very, very clear that you had all sorts of mixtures.
Exactly.
An Italian family would have Jewish friends and Polish friends and Irish. Well, there weren't that many Irish by that time. The Irish had moved, as you probably know, from the North End to the West End much earlier.
Right.
And by the 1950s, they were already moving out to other places, to Somerville, to Cambridge, to all of the surrounding suburbs. And even the Jews were sort of getting a little bit old and beginning to move out. And it was really predominantly, I figured that at the time we were studying the West End, it was about 40% Italian. And still quite a few Poles, quite a few Jews, but very, very few Irish.
Another thing that was fine and unique about the West End was the different type of stores and businesses in the West End was a reflection of the population too. You know, you had Italian bakeries and Jewish bakeries and kosher meat markets and fish markets, and we had a chicken house where you get fresh chicken, and that was really great about the West End.
Well, I think the stores were very, very important. I talk about the stores in my book because of the following kind of thing that was very interesting. At the time, many social workers were complaining about dependent people who didn't keep enough food in their house and always had to go out for food. I began to look at this and I said, that's nonsense. That people go out for food every day because that's what they want to do, because that's the only way they can keep in touch with everybody else.
Socialize. It's part of socializing.
That's right. And then I studied a family that had already, they had kind of moved out of the working class. They were pretty comfortable, and they used to go do a kind of middle class Friday night shopping and go out and buy lots of food. What was interesting about it is they always left enough things unpurchased, so they had to go out down every day
to
the store.
Yeah.
How else were you going to find out who was sick, who was getting married, who was getting...
Exactly.
I mean, it was that kind of thing that was so important. So I think the stores were terribly important.
They were. Did you, in your study, did you find, to us growing up on the West End, what was important to us is the corner. Either the corner store or just hanging on a corner. Yeah. And your corner was your territory. But you really didn't have a territory because even though you hung on one corner, you were noted to be from that corner, but you still got along with all your friends from other corners too.
Yeah.
Did you find that?
Well, but that was more true for the teenagers than for the older people. The older people had their stoops.
Exactly.
I mean, and they'd pull out a chair in front of the house, and a few people would be sitting around and talking, so they didn't so much pay attention to the corners. And the men, for the most part, would be sitting around either in the corner bar or whatever it might be.
It was sort of a bocce court, too. I don't know if you recall that. On the black field in the West End. And speaking of Stoops and the older folks hanging around the Stoops, like my granddad came from Italy and settled in the West End, and he was known as the mayor of Brighton Street. And he'd be from early in the morning till late at night. He'd sit on his little chair in front of the stoop with a scally cap on and his little stogies, and he'd talk to everybody that walked by. And that was pretty common in the West End.
Yeah.
Or hanging out the window, too.
Oh, that was very important. In fact, one of the interesting things when you compare what happened before and what happened after, that was the big frustration. That even when people lived near old friends and even when they lived near family, they never had that same experience again. I remember one family told me they had moved to a sort of small ranch-style house, and they had tried to resuscitate some of the friendliness of the West End. So they would invite neighbors into their backyard for a cookout or something of that sort, and that was okay. Even so, this guy said that if he parked his car half an inch on his neighbor's property or in front of his neighbor's property, they would complain. Whereas the same family, was just very, very much part of the West End. Exactly. The wife told me, for instance, that if for some reason or other her husband parked his car in front of, left his car during the day when he was going to work, that by noontime she would have had 10 calls from people asking if he was sick.
Oh, wow.
That kind of thing.
In fact, in the tapings that I've done some tapings of memories of people from the West End, and everybody, no matter who I spoke to, said, even though we say the West End might not have been a unique place to live, but when they moved from the West End to other parts of the city or state or wherever, they have never found a place like the West End. The friendliness, the camaraderie, and the closeness, and that when they left the West End, that left with them, and so there was a uniqueness that I feel that's there. And not only that, when people left the West End also, that they come back to hang out in the West End, what was left of the West End anyway.
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the observations that I made, and I must say it was unexpected. I hadn't really expected anything like this. I have to tell you the story because it's an interesting story. One of the things that Lindemann had been studying was what he called the grief response, the way people reacted to the death of a partner or a child or whatever. We hadn't done much with grief, and so at one point somebody on the staff said, why don't we just ask people how they felt when they left the West End, and was it a loss? Did they feel sad? Questions of this sort. And we made up what the system we used. We'd ask these questions, and then we'd make up a series of codes and so forth. And one evening, the guy who was in charge of coding came to me, and he said, we can't code these questions. And I said, why not? He said, because none of the answers fit. And so he showed me a list of the answers that didn't fit. And I looked at them, and I practically burst into tears when I saw them. Mm-hmm. They were such sad responses. There was another staff member there, a woman, gave her these responses. She looked at them, and she literally burst into tears. Mm-hmm. Really just terribly sad. I still carry a brick around. I still have a brick from the house I lived in my apartment.
I do too, believe me.
I know.
Yeah.
Or I almost took the gas pipe, or things of this sort. And on this basis, I wrote a paper which actually became a very famous paper, maybe because of the title. I called it Grieving for a Lost Home. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is a fairly unique kind of response. Mm-hmm. At least, I would say, almost half the population experienced a very severe grief response. Not just nostalgia, not just sadness, not just missing the place, but they were really deeply depressed because of the loss of the West End.
I was going to get into that, too. I find that, too, of some of the friends that I've had. It really left a toll on a lot of friends and family. And, in fact, a lot of the elderly folk died of broken hearts when they left the West End, because that was when they come over from the old country, that was the only life they knew, and that was their whole life is the West End. And suddenly this was taken from them. And my grandfather, I know, died of a broken heart.
Really?
Yeah, from his home in the West End being taken away, and he moved to East Block, and he didn't last very long. Just wandered around the streets in the East Block, and then we had so did you find that?
Well, that's hard to judge. All I know is that many of the doctors and psychiatrists who lived in the area, whom I knew, would say to me, who knew that I was studying the West End, they say, we had a whole bunch of people coming in who came because of the relocation from the West End. Mm-hmm. I tried to study that. I tried to ask myself, well, did it get any worse? Did it get any better? It's very, very hard to say. Mm-hmm. The only thing I can really say about that is that when people moved very close to their former friends and neighbors, or when they had a marked improvement in housing, which was not all that usual, then things got better rather than worse. But for most people, I can't say whether death, disease, anything else occurred because of it. All I can say is that it was very, very rough going. Mm-hmm. And they certainly did show this tremendous grief response very, very often.
Another thing that was in the West End, too, that people revolved their lives around the settlement houses.
Yes.
Can you tell us what you found in that respect? The West End House and the Peabody House and the Heath Christian Center.
All I can really say about that is it was terribly, terribly important. And I think it's kind of sad that the newer migrants to the United States or the newer migrants to the large cities, whether they be black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic from other areas, from Asia, that they don't have that kind of thing, and I think it's most unfortunate. Mm-hmm. I think that it was having those settlement houses that helped the Irish, the Jews, and the Italians really to adapt to this country and this society and made their lives a lot more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. And another thing, too, that played a big part in the lives of people from the West End was the churches and synagogues and temples. Did you...
Yeah, I think they were terribly important. Not just as religious institutions,
exactly, right.
but as social institutions.
Social institutions, right.
Like I said before, one of the things that was so striking, and this is what is similar about a number of working class communities, when you meet the same people at the store, at church, at the schoolyard, at the settlement house, day after day after day, pretty soon you do become a community. And that's what was so important in the West End. It was this, what we sometimes refer to as a close-knit network, in which everybody not only knew everybody else, but everybody else knew everybody else. And it was a whole linking of people so that your friends were friends with one another, which really made it a very lively, exciting place for people to live. The other thing about it is that people were terrified about the idea of leaving.
Exactly.
I mean, here they had lived so long, and, you know, what was scary for many people were afraid of walking into the West End. And, of course, the people who lived there were just absolutely comfortable with it, and they were terrified about moving anywhere else. And actually, as it turns out, a lot of the people moved 2 or 3 times after they left the West End. They couldn't really find an appropriate place right away. Like one family I remember said, well, we moved to this apartment, and our neighbors underneath would complain about the kids making too much noise. They never complained about such things in the West End.
Exactly.
So they moved again.
Another thing that was great about the West End that was taken away from a lot of people was location. You could walk anywhere in the city. You had the Charles River, and that was another thing that was...
Yeah. Although people didn't use the city as freely as you might expect. I think they really sort of tried to keep a little bit bounded. I think one of the things that happens is that when you move into an area from a foreign country, or in which most of the people are sort of second generation at best, there's a certain kind of fear about this strange outside world. So whenever you go out, you're a little bit scared by what you see. And so I think often people didn't use it as much as they might have otherwise. Of course, there was the Esplanade. That was marvelous.
And we had you had the Common,
and you had the Common,
the public garden.
Right. Those were terribly useful.
And downtown Boston too. All the department stores. It was all within walking. Knott Station, South Station. Was all within walking distance of the West End. And you really didn't need an automobile in those.
That was the dangerous thing. That's why the Urban Renewal Administration wanted it.
But even though the West End was noted as a safe place, there was very little crime in the West End.
I know that, but people were afraid of it nonetheless. Outsiders.
Yeah. As far as the only crime that I remember, if you want to call it crime, was a little gambling going on in the street. You know,
there was very little crime. As a matter of fact, one of the sad things is that in the urban renewal proposal that the city had to make to the federal government, what they did was to add on a piece of Scully Square.
Exactly, right.
In their statistics to show that there was crime in the West End, because the West End itself had very little crime.
Well, not only did they add the piece on about crime, they also added a piece on a study that there was a lot of I forget what type of disease, that there was disease ridden in the West End. And what they did was they went to a few rooming houses on the border of Scully Square where there were derelicts living, and they had a big part of their study was the West End was infested with some sort of disease or something, which
and alcoholism and vacancy rates.
Exactly.
And things of that
and they used, like you say, a little. So they really fooled the public and the world when they took the West End. And did you find it a tragedy, or how did you? What was your perception of it?
I thought it was a very, very tragic event. That there were a very small number of people who benefited from it, and the vast majority just really had a miserable time because of it. And there was nothing that was ever, as you know, nothing that was ever going to happen in their lives that could make up for it.
Exactly.
And, you know, when we move from one place to another, it's difficult to adjust.
And that's by choice. This wasn't by choice.
But this was forced. Right.
Okay.
So it was anger at being forced and very great difficulty adjusting to a completely different way of life from anything you had ever experienced before.
Exactly. And this played a big toll on people's lives. It really did.
I mean, now sometimes people did show a benefit from it. Let me give you an example. I'm thinking of two families, husband and wife. In one case, the wife says, when she's interviewed afterwards, says, well, you know, in the West End, my husband used to come home, and he'd sit down in front of the TV right after dinner and put his feet up, and in 2 minutes he'd be asleep. And I'd go up to my girlfriend, and we'd spend the evening together. Now, when he comes home, I don't have a girlfriend upstairs, so I don't let him fall asleep.
Okay. That was a unique story.
Right, and they've become sort of closer because of this. On the other hand, there was the other family where the woman said, well, you know, my husband would go out for a drink, and in the West End he'd come in at midnight, and now sometimes he doesn't come in.
Oh, wow. So that goes to show you, yeah.
Yes, the other side of...
Can you tell us some of the other people who were involved in the study with you that you recall?
Oh, yeah, there were a lot of people. It was a big staff, and sort of the most prominent people were, first of all, Herb Gans, who was doing a separate kind of thing, and then a man by the name of Chester Hartman, who now has some fairly prominent positions in Washington. He's become a researcher. He's done many studies of urban renewal. He was a physical planner. And then a number of other people that were fairly close. A woman by the name of Ellen Fitzgerald Richards, who was a very important person in that study, and Peggy Gleicher, who did a lot of work there. And I wrote papers together with almost all of them. A woman by the name of Joan Levin Eckline. There were quite a few people all working on it. And
did you all come to the same conclusion or perception of the
pretty
results
much.
of the West End?
Pretty much, yeah. You see, one of the differences between myself and Herb Gans was that I think he came in expecting this. I came in much more neutral. I really didn't have any expectation. I had been interested in a lot of social issues, but I had no way of... he had been studying people in different environments before. And so it was even more startling that I came to that same conclusion, that this was a tragic event that ruined many people's lives, or if it didn't ruin them, at least it made things very, very difficult for them.
And do you still teach this today, or up until recently? That you,
oh, yeah.
This was part of your prominent...
Oh, yeah. I mean, the things I've been studying since then are a little different, but really I still use some of that same material for clarifying the meaning of community in people's lives.
And one of the unique things about the West End is, I find unique, is even after it being gone 30 years, people still are so close together when they meet. And no matter where you go in the world or the country, and you see somebody from the West End, you hug and you kiss, you embrace, because we all suffered a common loss. And when we see each other, you know it, you know?
Yeah. You know what it's like? It's like when people came from the same village in Italy or Russia or Poland or anywhere else, and meet other people who came from that same village.
Exactly.
Even though, I mean, they immediately sort of cling together, and I think it's very much the same kind of thing.
Well, we went by so fast that we're coming to the conclusion of our show. Gee, so we're honored to have you here today, and you gave us a good insight of your study, and we'd like people to, the world of the urban working class. So we'd like the people to read your book and get it at your public library or buy it at your...
They can't buy it. It's out of print.
Okay, at the public library. And please read the book and you'll get an idea of Professor Freed's workings here. Thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome. I thought we had just gotten started.
Okay, thank you. And see you at the next West End video newsletter.
I'd forget if I could. Out of sight. not